I sat at the dinner table, trying to digest the words my son had just uttered. "We're leaving tomorrow," he said, beaming with pride about the $2 million sale of my beach house. "Today I'm going to tell you something that will make you question everything you thought you knew about family trust and unconditional love, something so raw and painful that I've kept it buried until now. Make sure to subscribe to hear more stories like mine, because if my experience can help even one person recognize the warning signs before it's too late, then sharing this heartbreak will have been worth it. Please, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, hit that like button so this message can reach others who need to hear they're not alone." The words hung in the air like smoke after a fire. My son Daniel sat across from me in my Chicago apartment, his expensive suit catching the evening light filtering through the sheer curtains I'd bought at that little shop on Michigan Avenue 20 years ago. He was cutting into the pot roast I'd spent all afternoon preparing, the same recipe I'd made every Sunday when he was growing up. Back when he still looked at me with something other than calculated assessment in his eyes. His wife Jennifer sat beside him, her diamond earrings glittering as she nodded along to whatever he was saying, though I could barely hear the words anymore. The sound of my own heartbeat was drowning everything out, a thunderous pounding that made my hands tremble as I gripped my fork. I had set this table with my grandmother's china, the delicate plates with tiny blue flowers that had survived the journey from our old neighborhood on the south side. I ironed the linen napkins, the ones I only brought out for special occasions. I'd even put on the pearl necklace Daniel's father had given me on our 20th anniversary, back when he was still alive. Back when I still believed that love and sacrifice were currencies that would always be honored. The roast was perfect, tender and seasoned just the way Daniel liked it. The mashed potatoes were whipped smooth, no lumps, because he'd always been particular about texture. I'd made his favorite apple pie too, the one with the lattice crust that took me 2 hours to weave properly. Everything had to be perfect, because somewhere deep inside, I still believed that if I just tried hard enough, if I just showed enough love, things would go back to the way they used to be. But nothing was going back. That became crystal clear when Daniel wiped his mouth with my grandmother's napkin and said those words again, slower this time, as if speaking to a child. "We're leaving tomorrow." "Mom, the beach house sold for $2 million. The closing was this morning. We'll be in Malibu by the weekend." He said it with such casual triumph, such obvious satisfaction, that for a moment I thought I'd misheard him. The beach house. My beach house. The one I'd bought with my own money, my own sweat, my own decades of working double shifts as a nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The house in Michigan where I'd planned to retire, where I'd imagined watching sunsets from the wraparound porch I'd helped design, where I'd dreamed of hosting my grandchildren for summer vacations, teaching them to skip stones across Lake Michigan the way I'd taught Daniel when he was small. I set down my fork very carefully. My hands were shaking so badly that the silver clinked against the porcelain, a sharp little sound that made Jennifer glance up at me with something that might have been pity or might have been impatience. I couldn't tell anymore. These days, everyone's expressions seemed to blur together into the same vague condescension, the same barely concealed annoyance that I was still here, still taking up space, still expecting to matter. Daniel reached for the wine bottle, the expensive Cabernet he'd brought, not because he thought I'd enjoy it, but because he wanted to drink it himself. He poured himself a generous glass, filled Jennifer's halfway and ignored mine completely, though it sat empty beside my plate. "What do you mean the house sold?" I finally managed to say. My voice came out smaller than I'd intended, a weak little whisper that got lost in the sound of Daniel chewing. He looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time since he'd arrived, and I saw something in his eyes that made my stomach drop. It wasn't guilt or remorse or even acknowledgement of the enormity of what he'd just told me. It was satisfaction, pride, the look of a man who'd just closed a very profitable business deal and was pleased with his own cleverness. "I sold it, Mom," he said, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "You signed the power of attorney years ago, remember? After Dad died?" You said you wanted me to handle your finances, make sure everything was taken care of. Well, I took care of it. $2 million, cash sale, and I already have buyers lined up for 3 condos in California. This is going to set us up for life. The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles going white against the dark wood. The power of attorney. Yes, I remembered signing it. I remembered sitting in that lawyer's office 5 years ago, just after my husband's funeral, when everything felt overwhelming and impossible. Daniel had been so insistent, so concerned. "Mom, you can't handle all this alone," he'd said, his hand on my shoulder, his voice so gentle and caring. "Let me help you. Let me take care of the financial stuff so you don't have to worry." I'd believed him. God help me, I'd believed every word. I'd signed those papers thinking I was making things easier for myself, thinking I was ensuring that if anything happened to me, if I got sick or confused, someone I trusted would be there to protect my interests. But he hadn't protected anything. He'd sold my house. He'd sold my future, my peace, my one piece of security in this world, and he'd done it without even telling me, without asking, without giving me a chance to say goodbye to the place where I'd planned to spend my final years, where I'd imagined sitting on that porch with a book and a cup of tea, where I'd pictured my grandchildren running through the rooms, their laughter echoing off the pine walls. He'd taken all of that and turned it into dollars, into profit, into his own financial security, and he was sitting here in my home, eating my food, drinking expensive wine, and expecting me to congratulate him on his business acumen. I looked at Jennifer, hoping for some sign that she understood how wrong this was, but she was studying her manicure, her perfectly painted nails catching the light. She'd never liked me much. I could tell from the first time Daniel brought her home, from the way she'd assessed my modest apartment with barely concealed disdain, from how she'd suggested I might want to update my wardrobe when they started taking me to their work functions. She came from money, real family wealth, the kind that stretched back generations. To her, I was just the working-class mother-in-law who didn't understand investment portfolios or net worth optimization or any of the other phrases they threw around at their dinner parties. I was an embarrassment, a reminder that Daniel hadn't always lived in a luxury high-rise, hadn't always worn $1,000 suits, hadn't always had access to the kind of money that made people like Jennifer pay attention. The pot roast sat congealing on my plate. I couldn't eat. I couldn't breathe. The walls of my small apartment seemed to be closing in, the familiar space suddenly feeling like a trap. This was my home, my sanctuary, but even here I wasn't safe. Even here, my son could reach in and take whatever he wanted, could dismantle my life piece by piece while smiling and asking for seconds on the mashed potatoes. I thought about the beach house, about the day I'd closed on it 15 years ago. I'd been so proud, so thrilled to finally own something that was completely mine. The down payment had come from years of saving, from working overtime shifts, from saying no to vacations and new clothes and anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. I'd scrimped and sacrificed and done without, so that one day, when I was too old to work anymore, I'd have somewhere beautiful to go, somewhere I could rest. Daniel was still talking, something about investment opportunities and market timing and how lucky it was that he'd found buyers so quickly. His voice washed over me like cold water, each word another small violence. I wanted to scream at him, to demand how he could do this to me, but the words wouldn't come. They were stuck somewhere in my chest, trapped behind years of conditioning that told me mothers don't raise their voices at their children, that families work things out calmly, that blood is thicker than water and we forgive each other no matter what. So I sat there in silence, my hands folded in my lap, my eyes burning with unshed tears, while my son casually described how he'd liquidated my dreams to fund his own. The dining room clock ticked steadily, marking each second of this nightmare. Outside my window, Chicago continued its evening rush. People heading home to their families, to dinners and conversations that probably didn't involve this particular brand of betrayal. I could see the lights of the city coming on, thousands of windows glowing in the twilight, each one representing someone else's life, someone else's hopes and fears. Did any of them feel like this? Did any of them sit at their own tables, surrounded by the remnants of a meal they'd lovingly prepared, wondering how they'd become so invisible to the people they'd given everything for? I thought about calling someone, my sister maybe, or my old friend Margaret from the hospital. But what would I say? My son sold my house and I didn't even know about it? It sounded impossible. The kind of thing that happened in news stories or television dramas, not in real life. Not to people like me, people who'd raised their children right, who'd sacrificed and loved and done everything a mother was supposed to do. But here I was, living proof that good intentions and unconditional love weren't always enough. Sometimes they just made you an easier target. Years ago, I had believed in something. I had believed that family was sacred, that the bonds between parent and child were unbreakable, that love could overcome any obstacle. I'd raised Daniel with these values, taught him about loyalty and respect, and the importance of taking care of the people who took care of you. I'd told him stories about my own mother, who'd worked herself to exhaustion to keep food on our table, and about how I'd promised myself I'd be there for my children the way she'd been there for me. I'd thought I was building something lasting, creating a foundation of trust that would support us all through whatever life threw our way. Instead, I'd apparently been raising someone who saw me as a resource to be managed, an asset to be liquidated when the time was right. I suppose I'd been naive. Looking back now, I can see the signs I'd missed, the small moments that should have warned me about what was coming. Like 3 years ago, when Daniel suggested I add his name to my checking account, just in case of emergencies. Or 2 years ago, when he started asking pointed questions about my retirement savings and whether I'd considered downsizing from my apartment. Or last year, when he'd casually mentioned that the property values in Michigan were skyrocketing and that beach houses were becoming quite the investment opportunity. I'd thought he was just making conversation, showing interest in my life. I hadn't realized he was conducting reconnaissance, gathering information for the moment when he'd swoop in and take control. The forgiveness I'd always preached suddenly felt like a weakness, a character flaw rather than a virtue. How many times had I forgiven Daniel for small cruelties, for missed birthdays and forgotten phone calls and promises that evaporated like morning fog? How many times had I made excuses for him, told myself he was busy with his career, that he loved me even if he didn't always show it? I'd spent decades practicing the kind of unconditional acceptance that I'd thought was the hallmark of good parenting. Now I wondered if I'd just been teaching him that there were no consequences for treating me badly, that he could take and take and take without ever giving anything back. Jennifer stood up then, smoothing her designer dress with manicured hands. "We should get going, Daniel," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "We still need to pack." She didn't even look at me as she said it, didn't acknowledge that this conversation had just destroyed whatever remained of my sense of security. To her, this was just another dinner, another obligation fulfilled, another box checked on her social calendar. Daniel nodded and stood too, leaving his napkin crumpled beside his half-eaten pie. "Thanks for dinner, Mom," he said, leaning down to kiss my cheek. His lips felt cold against my skin. "We'll call you once we're settled in California. Maybe you can come visit sometime. Maybe I could visit, in the house he'd bought with the money from selling mine, in the life he'd built on the foundation of my demolished dreams." The audacity of it took my breath away. I sat frozen in my chair as they gathered their coats, as Daniel pocketed his expensive car keys, as Jennifer checked her phone and sighed with impatience. They were walking toward my door, toward their future, toward everything they'd taken from me, and I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but watch them go. At the threshold, Daniel turned back. "Oh, I meant to tell you," he said, his hand on the doorknob. "I set up a small trust fund with some of the proceeds. It'll give you about $1,500 a month. Should be plenty to cover your expenses here." And then they were gone. The door closing with a soft click that sounded like the end of everything I'd thought I knew about love and family and what children owed their parents. The apartment felt cavernous in their absence, every shadow deeper, every sound amplified. I sat at my table surrounded by the ruins of the dinner I'd prepared, the food gone cold, the candles burned down to nubs. My hands were still shaking. My chest felt tight, as if someone had wrapped bands of steel around my ribs and was slowly pulling them tighter. $1,500 a month. A pittance. Less than a quarter of what I'd have gotten if I'd sold the house myself, if I'd had any say in the matter at all. And he'd presented it like a gift, like he was being generous, taking care of his poor old mother who couldn't possibly manage her own affairs. The beach house had been more than just property. It had been the culmination of everything I'd worked for, every sacrifice I'd made, every moment I'd chosen duty over desire. I'd bought it after my husband died, using the life insurance money and my own savings, investing in a future where I could finally breathe, finally rest, finally stop working so hard just to survive. The house sat on 3 acres overlooking Lake Michigan, with windows that caught the sunrise and a garden where I'd planned to grow tomatoes and roses. I'd spent weekends there over the past decade, slowly furnishing it with pieces I'd collected from estate sales and antique shops, creating a space that felt like mine in a way nowhere else ever had. Every room held a memory of planning and hoping, of imagining the life I'd have there when I finally retired from nursing, when my body finally gave out, and I could no longer handle the 12-hour shifts and the physical demands of patient care. I'd sacrificed that house long before Daniel sold it. I'd sacrificed it with every year I'd worked past when I should have retired. Every time I'd chosen to help him financially instead of putting money toward my own future. When he'd started his business 10 years ago and needed capital, I'd given him $50,000, money I'd earmarked for renovations on the beach house. When his first venture failed and he needed to pay off debts, I'd given him another $30,000, money that should have gone toward replacing the house's aging roof. When Jennifer wanted a big wedding, I'd contributed $20,000 to make sure everything was perfect, even though it meant delaying my own retirement by 3 years. I'd given and given and given, always believing that one day he'd remember these sacrifices, that one day he'd want to take care of me the way I'd taken care of him. But children don't remember the same way parents do. They don't catalog every sacrifice, don't keep mental ledgers of what was given up on their behalf. To Daniel, those checks I'd written were probably just dim memories, vague acknowledgments that yes, Mom had helped out once or twice. He didn't remember, or maybe he chose not to remember, that each of those checks represented months or years of my life, time I'd spent working when I should have been resting, opportunities I'd passed up so he could have what he needed. The house wasn't just wood and nails and a nice view. It was the physical manifestation of decades of my labor, of countless decisions to put someone else's needs before my own, and now it was gone, converted into abstract numbers in Daniel's bank account, transformed into seed money for his next business venture. That night, after I'd cleared the table and washed the dishes and put away my grandmother's china, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out the old photo albums from the closet in my bedroom, the heavy books with their plastic-covered pages and fading snapshots. I sat on my bed with these relics of the past spread around me, looking at images of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. There was Daniel as a baby, chubby and smiling, his tiny fist wrapped around my finger. Daniel at 5, missing his front teeth, proudly holding up a drawing he'd made for me at kindergarten. Daniel at 10, standing beside me at his father's company picnic, his arm around my waist. Daniel at 15, tall and gangly, rolling his eyes at something I'd said, but still letting me take his picture. Daniel at 22, graduating from college, hugging me tight while his father beamed in the background. Where had that boy gone? The one who'd brought me dandelions from the yard and called them flowers. The one who'd cried when I had to work late and couldn't attend his school play. The one who'd told me I was the best mom in the world, that he'd take care of me when he grew up, that I'd never have to worry about anything because he'd always be there. I stared at these photos until my vision blurred, trying to find some clue about when things had changed, when my son had stopped being the person I'd raised and become this stranger who could steal from me without remorse. But there was no single moment, no clear line of demarcation. It had happened gradually, so slowly that I hadn't noticed until it was too late. The phone calls had become less frequent. The visits had shortened. The warmth had cooled degree by degree until what remained was this professional courtesy, this distant politeness that felt worse than outright hostility. I'd worked my entire adult life. Started as a nurse's aide at 19, back when Daniel's father and I first got married, and were living in a studio apartment with secondhand furniture and more love than money. I'd gone back to school while raising Daniel, studying at night after he went to bed, taking tests between diaper changes and story time. I'd earned my RN license when Daniel was 6, and I'd spent the next 40 years working in hospitals, caring for strangers, holding hands and wiping tears and bearing witness to the most intimate moments of other people's lives. I'd worked through holidays and birthdays. I'd worked through my own mother's funeral. I'd worked 3 weeks after my husband died because we needed the income and the house payment wasn't going to make itself. I'd worked until my back ached and my feet swelled and my hands trembled from exhaustion. And I'd done it all because I believed that hard work would be rewarded, that sacrifice would be honored, that if I just kept pushing forward, eventually I'd reach a place where I could rest. The beach house had been that place, that reward, that finish line I'd been running toward for 40 years. And now it was gone, sold out from under me by the child I'd sacrificed everything for, the child who apparently saw my life's work as his inheritance to claim whenever convenient. The power of attorney I'd signed had seemed like such a reasonable precaution at the time. Daniel had explained it all so carefully, had made it sound like simple common sense. What if you have a stroke, Mom? What if you get dementia? Someone needs to be able to access your accounts, pay your bills, make sure you're taken care of. I'd nodded along, believing him, trusting that his concern was genuine. Now I understood that it hadn't been concern at all. It had been strategy. He'd been laying groundwork, establishing legal authority, making sure that when the time came to convert my assets into his assets, he'd have all the tools he needed. I barely slept that night. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city outside my window, the endless traffic and distant sirens and all the noise of other people living their lives. My mind kept circling back to the same questions, the same bitter realizations. How long had he been planning this? Had he waited for some specific moment, or had it been opportunistic? Had he discussed it with Jennifer over breakfast one morning, the two of them casually deciding over coffee and croissants that it was time to liquidate his mother's property? Had he felt even a moment of guilt, or had the promise of $2 million been enough to silence whatever conscience he might have once possessed? By morning, I felt ancient, as if I'd aged 20 years overnight. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a woman I barely recognized. My skin looked gray and papery. My eyes were sunken and red-rimmed. My hair, which I'd always kept neatly styled, stuck out at odd angles. I looked like what I was, a 73-year-old woman who'd just been betrayed by the person she loved most in the world. I looked defeated, disposable, used up. I got dressed slowly, my arthritic fingers fumbling with buttons and zippers, my joints stiff from a night spent tensed in anxiety. I made coffee but couldn't drink it. I tried to eat toast, but the bread turned to sawdust in my mouth. The documents arrived 2 days later, delivered by courier in a manila envelope that felt heavy with finality. I signed for it with shaking hands, carried it to my small kitchen table, and sat staring at it for what felt like hours before I could bring myself to open it. Inside were copies of the sale paperwork, all neatly organized, all bearing my forged signature, all completely legal because I'd given Daniel the authority to sign on my behalf. There was a cover letter from his lawyer, explaining the terms of the trust he'd established, the monthly payments I'd receive, the restrictions on how I could access the principal. Everything had been arranged to look generous while actually giving me as little control as possible over my own money. The beach house, which I'd bought for $300,000 15 years ago, had sold for $2 million. After closing costs and fees, Daniel would clear about $1.9 million. The trust he'd established for me contained $250,000, which at $1,500 a month would last approximately 14 years, assuming I lived that long and didn't have any major medical expenses. The remaining $1.65 million was his to do with as he pleased. I should have been furious. I should have been screaming, calling lawyers, demanding justice. But all I felt was hollow, scraped out, empty. This was the son I'd raised. This was the result of 40 years of sacrifice and love and devotion. This was what I got for believing that family meant something, that blood ties created obligations that went both ways. I'd been a fool, and now I was a poor fool, dependent on the charity of the man who'd stolen from me, waiting for my monthly allowance like a child who'd misbehaved and had her privileges restricted. I sat at that table for hours, reading and rereading those documents, trying to find some loophole, some error, some way to undo what had been done. But it was all legal, all proper, all completely above board. Daniel had been careful, or more likely, his lawyers had been careful, making sure that every detail was ironclad, that there'd be no way for me to challenge the sale or reclaim what had been taken. My signature on the power of attorney had signed away not just my authority, but my agency, my right to make decisions about my own life. I'd become a ward of my own child, someone to be managed rather than consulted, and the worst part was that I'd done it to myself. I'd signed the papers that made it all possible because I'd trusted him. The phone rang several times that day. I let it go to voicemail. I couldn't talk to anyone. Couldn't explain what had happened, couldn't bear to hear the pity or judgment or advice that would inevitably follow. People would ask why I'd signed a power of attorney without restrictions. They'd wonder why I hadn't been more careful. They'd suggest that maybe Daniel had a point, that maybe I was too old to manage property, that maybe this was all for the best, and maybe they'd be right. Maybe I was naive and foolish and too trusting. Maybe I deserved this for being stupid enough to believe that love was enough to protect me from the people I loved most. But even as I thought these things, another part of me rebelled. I hadn't been stupid. I'd been a mother, doing what mothers do, which is trust their children and want the best for them and make themselves vulnerable in ways that leave them open to exactly this kind of betrayal. I'd been operating under a different set of rules than Daniel. Rules that said family protected each other, that children honored their parents, that taking advantage of someone's love and trust was unthinkable. He'd been operating under different rules entirely, rules about profit maximization and opportunity costs and striking while the iron was hot. We'd been playing different games, and I'd lost because I hadn't even realized we were competing. I thought about my own mother then, dead now for 15 years, buried in Rose Hill Cemetery on the north side. She'd been a force of nature, a woman who'd raised 5 children on a secretary's salary after my father died young. She'd never had much, but what she had, she'd shared freely. She'd believed in family, in sacrifice, in doing without so your children could have more. I'd modeled my own parenting after hers, thinking I was following a blueprint for how to raise good people. But maybe the world had changed. Maybe the values she'd taught me, the values I'd tried to pass on to Daniel, were outdated now. Relics of a time when people thought differently about obligation and gratitude and what we owe to the people who gave us life. Or maybe I'd just failed somehow, raised a son who'd learned all the wrong lessons from my example. Maybe when I'd taught him about hard work and sacrifice, He'd only learned that some people work and sacrifice while others benefit. Maybe when I'd shown him unconditional love, he'd learned that some people's love could be taken for granted, used up, exploited without consequence. These thoughts circled in my head like vultures, picking at the carcass of my self-esteem, finding all the weak spots and vulnerable places. I'd been so proud of Daniel for so long, so thrilled by his success, so eager to brag to my friends and co-workers about his business ventures, and his beautiful wife and his expensive apartment. I'd lived vicariously through his achievements, taking pride in them as if they were my own, as if his success somehow validated all the choices I'd made and sacrifices I'd endured. Now that pride felt like another betrayal, another way I'd deceived myself. His success had come at least partly from me, from the money I'd given him, from the opportunities my sacrifices had created. And now he was using that success to take even more, to strip away the last vestiges of my financial security and call it good business sense. I looked around my apartment, at the modest furniture and outdated appliances, at the life I'd built from hard work and careful savings. This place had always felt temporary, a way station on the road to something better. The beach house had been my reward, my proof that the years of struggle had been worth it, that I'd made it to the other side of all that sacrifice. Without it, this apartment became permanent, the place where I'd spend whatever years remained to me, growing older and frailer, dependent on Daniel's $1,500 monthly allowance and whatever I could scrape together from Social Security. I'd never travel now, never do any of the things I'd dreamed about, never have the peace and rest I'd worked so long to earn. I'd just exist, marking time until my body gave out. Another invisible old woman taking up space in a world that had no use for her. The thing that hurt most wasn't the money itself. $2 million was an abstraction, a number so large I couldn't really conceptualize it. What hurt was what that money represented, the dreams and plans and future it contained. Every dollar Daniel had taken from me was a day I'd worked, a sacrifice I'd made, a piece of my life I'd traded for his comfort and security. He'd taken my past and my future in one transaction, converted 40 years of labor into his investment portfolio, and then thanked me for dinner as if nothing had happened. That casual cruelty, that complete inability to recognize what he'd done, felt worse than if he'd stolen from me openly. At least then I could have fought back, could have felt righteously angry instead of this sick, confused sense that maybe I was wrong to feel betrayed. Maybe this was normal. Maybe this was what all children did to their aging parents when the opportunity arose. I wanted to call him. I picked up my phone a dozen times that day, my finger hovering over his contact information, my heart pounding with the need to hear his voice, to demand an explanation, to make him understand what he'd done. But I never dialed. What would I say? He'd already made his position clear. The house was sold. The money was his. My feelings about it were irrelevant. Calling him would only give him another opportunity to explain why this was actually good for me, why I should be grateful, why he was really doing me a favor by taking control of assets I was too old and confused to manage properly. I couldn't bear to hear those words. Couldn't stand the thought of him patronizing me one more time, treating me like a child who didn't understand complex financial matters when what I actually didn't understand was how my son had become this stranger. So I sat in silence, my phone growing heavy in my hand, the unsent call hanging in the air between us like all the other conversations we'd never have, all the truths that would remain unspoken because I'd been trained my whole life to be a good mother, which apparently meant being quiet and accepting and grateful for whatever crumbs of affection your children chose to throw your way. I'd been raised to believe that mothers who complained about their children were bad mothers, that good mothers took whatever they got with grace and gratitude. Well, I'd been gracious and grateful for 73 years, and where had it gotten me? Sitting alone in my apartment while my son spent the money he'd stolen from me, probably congratulating himself on his financial acumen, probably telling Jennifer what a shrewd move it had been to sell now while the market was hot. I realized then, in that moment of bitter clarity, that I'd been complicit in my own exploitation. I'd taught Daniel that I was a resource to be tapped, that my purpose was to give, and he was entitled to take. Every time I'd handed over money without expecting repayment, every time I'd forgiven a slight without demanding acknowledgement, every time I'd accepted less than I deserved because I didn't want to make waves or seem demanding or be one of those difficult mothers who expected too much from their children, I'd been training him to treat me exactly this way. I'd been so desperate to be loved, so terrified of being seen as a burden, that I'd made myself into a doormat. And now I was surprised that people wiped their feet on me. The next morning, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years. I called in sick to the hospital. At 73, I was probably the oldest working nurse on my floor, kept on more out of institutional inertia than actual need. My supervisor didn't even sound surprised when I said I wouldn't be in. "Take care of yourself, Margaret," she said. And there was something in her tone that suggested she knew this was about more than a cold or a migraine, that she could hear in my voice the kind of defeat that doesn't come from physical illness. I hung up and sat staring at my phone, at the screen that could connect me to anyone in the world but seemed to connect me to no one at all. I spent that day in my bathrobe, not bothering to get dressed, not even bothering to brush my hair. What was the point? Who was there to see me? I made tea, but forgot to drink it. I turned on the television, but couldn't focus on what was happening. Everything felt muffled and distant, as if I were experiencing life from underwater. Around noon, I got up and went to my bedroom closet, pulling down a box from the top shelf. Inside were letters, dozens of them, old correspondence I'd saved over the years. Birthday cards from Daniel when he was young, his handwriting big and uneven, telling me I was the best mom ever. Mother's Day cards promising eternal love and gratitude. Thank you notes for checks I'd sent, for gifts I'd given, for help I'd provided. I read through them one by one, these artifacts from a relationship that no longer existed, and wondered where that child had gone, the one who'd written these sweet words in crayon and marker, and eventually in neat adult script. One letter stood out. Daniel had written it when he was in college, after I'd sent him money to cover an unexpected expense. "Thank you so much, Mom," he'd written. "I don't know what I'd do without you. You've always been there for me, always supported my dreams, and I promise that one day I'll pay you back for everything you've done. I'll take care of you the way you've taken care of me. That's a promise." I held that letter for a long time, reading and rereading those words. That promise, that vow he'd made 30 years ago when he was young and still believed in things like honor and reciprocity. He'd been sincere when he wrote it, I was sure of that. Something had changed him along the way, had transformed that earnest college student into the man who could steal from his mother and call it financial planning. I put the letters back in their box and shoved it to the back of the closet, unable to look at them anymore. They were lies, all of them. False promises from a person who no longer existed. Keeping them felt masochistic, like pressing on a bruise to see if it still hurt. Of course it still hurt. It would always hurt. But I didn't need physical reminders of promises Daniel had broken, dreams he'd crushed, love he'd betrayed. Those memories lived in my body now, in the tightness of my chest and the ache in my stomach, and the exhaustion that had settled into my bones like radiation. The doorbell rang unexpectedly that afternoon. I considered not answering, but some lifelong habit of politeness made me get up, smooth my bathrobe, and shuffle to the door. Through the peephole, I could see my granddaughter Emma standing in the hallway, shifting from foot to foot in that nervous way she had. Emma, Daniel's daughter, 23 years old and just starting her career as a graphic designer. I'd always been close to her, or as close as Daniel allowed. He'd never been comfortable with how much Emma seemed to like me, as if there were only so much affection to go around, and any she gave me was subtracted from what he received. I opened the door. Emma took one look at my face, and her expression crumpled. "Oh, Grandma," she said, and pushed past me into the apartment, wrapping her arms around me in a fierce hug. "I heard," she whispered into my shoulder. "Dad told me last night. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." And just like that, the dam broke. I started crying, really crying. The kind of deep, racking sobs that felt like they were being torn from somewhere vital. Emma held me through it. This young woman who barely knew me but seemed to understand my pain better than my own son ever had. She guided me to the couch, sat beside me, held my hand while I cried out 40 years of accumulated disappointments and betrayals, and swallowed anger. When I could finally speak, I asked her the question that had been eating at me. "Did you know? Did you know he was going to sell the house?" Emma shook her head, her own eyes red. "Not until it was done," she said. "He told me and Mom at dinner the night before he told you. He was so proud." "Grandma!" He kept talking about what a good investment it was, how he'd timed the market perfectly. I asked him if you knew, and he said you'd given him power of attorney to handle these things. I asked if you were okay with it, and he said you didn't need to know every detail of your financial management. Like you were senile or something. Like you couldn't make your own decisions. Hearing it from Emma somehow made it worse. Daniel hadn't just stolen from me. He justified it, rationalized it, convinced himself that he was actually helping me by taking control. And Jennifer had gone along with it, had probably encouraged it, because to people like them I was just an asset to be managed, not a person with rights and feelings and dreams of my own. They'd discussed it over dinner, probably in some expensive restaurant, weighing the pros and cons of liquidating my property, as if I were a portfolio rather than a human being. The casualness of it was almost more painful than the act itself. Emma stayed for hours that day. She made tea and forced me to drink it. She ordered Chinese food and made me eat a few bites. She let me talk and cry and rage without trying to fix anything or make excuses for her father. At one point, she said something that struck me like lightning. "My mom's friends do this too, you know. Her whole social circle. They're always talking about their parents like they're obstacles or burdens. They complain about having to visit them, joke about putting them in nursing homes, calculate how much their inheritances will be worth. It's like once people get old, they stop being people and become just these things that need to be dealt with. It's disgusting." She was right. I'd seen it too, heard it in the break room at work, listened to younger nurses complain about their aging parents with the kind of exasperation you'd reserve for a malfunctioning appliance. When did this happen? When did we become a society that viewed aging parents as burdens rather than people who'd earned respect through decades of sacrifice? When did it become acceptable to warehouse the elderly, to take their money and their autonomy, to treat them like children who couldn't be trusted with their own lives? My mother's generation had taken care of their parents, moved them into their homes when they got frail, honored their wisdom and experience. My generation seemed to do the opposite, seeing our parents as inconvenient reminders of our own mortality, problems to be solved with nursing homes and power of attorney and strategic financial planning. Before Emma left, she gave me her phone number, even though I already had it. "Call me anytime," she said. "Day or night." "I mean it, Grandma. You're not alone in this." I wanted to believe her, but the truth was that I was alone. Emma was kind, but she was also Daniel's daughter, and there were limits to how much she could help me without betraying her own father. She'd already taken a risk by coming here, by showing me sympathy. If Daniel found out, there'd be consequences for her. I'd seen how he controlled people, how he used money and approval as weapons to keep everyone in line. Emma lived in one of his investment properties, paying below market rent. She drove a car he'd co-signed for. She worked freelance, and he occasionally threw clients her way. She was just as dependent on him as I was, just as trapped in the web of obligation and control he'd spun around both of us. After she left, the apartment felt even emptier than before. The silence was oppressive, heavy with all the words I'd never said, all the boundaries I'd never set, all the times I'd chosen peace over justice because I'd been too afraid to fight. I thought about the beach house again, about the life I'd planned there. I'd imagined reading on the porch in the mornings, taking long walks along the shore in the evenings, maybe volunteering at the local library or community center. I'd thought about inviting Emma up for weekends, teaching her to sail the way I'd learned as a girl before life got complicated and hard. I'd pictured myself as someone who'd earned her rest, who'd put in her time and could finally just be, could exist without constantly proving her worth through service and sacrifice. That person felt like a stranger now. That optimistic woman who'd believed in happy endings and just rewards had died somewhere along the way. Probably in that moment when Daniel announced he'd sold my house with the same casual pride he'd have used to describe a particularly good parking spot he'd found. What remained was this hollowed-out version of myself, a woman who'd lost not just her property, but her faith in the fundamental fairness of the universe. I'd believed that good things happened to good people, that hard work was rewarded, that love and sacrifice were investments that paid dividends. I'd been wrong about all of it. The world didn't work that way. People weren't rewarded for being good. They were exploited for being naive. Hard work just made you tired. Love made you vulnerable. Sacrifice made you a target. I went to bed that night feeling older than I'd ever felt, ancient and used up and finished. I dreamed about the beach house, about walking through rooms that were no longer mine, past windows looking out on water I'd never see again. In the dream, Daniel was there, smiling that easy smile of his, explaining to strangers what a good investment the property had been, how he'd bought it from an elderly woman who didn't understand real estate values. He never mentioned that the elderly woman was his mother. He never mentioned that he'd stolen it. In the dream logic, that detail seemed irrelevant, unimportant, not worth bringing up. And maybe that was the truth of it. Maybe to Daniel, my feelings about the sale really were irrelevant. Maybe I'd already been erased from the story of that house, edited out like an inconvenient detail that complicated the narrative he wanted to tell. I woke up gasping, my heart racing, my sheets soaked with sweat. The clock on my nightstand glowed 3:17 in red digits. Around me, Chicago slept. Millions of people in their millions of beds, dreaming their millions of dreams. How many of them felt like this? How many of them were lying awake at 3 a.m, wondering how their lives had gone so wrong, trying to figure out where the happy ending they'd been promised had gotten lost? The self-help books and inspirational speakers and well-meaning friends all said the same thing. Take control of your life, set boundaries, demand respect. But what if you'd waited too long? What if you'd already given away so much of yourself that there was nothing left to reclaim? Over the next several days, I went through the motions of living without really being alive. I returned to work, but felt like I was watching myself from a distance, seeing some strange woman in scrubs going through the familiar routines of checking vitals and administering medications and charting symptoms. My coworkers noticed something was off. "Margaret, are you okay?" they'd ask, their faces creased with concern. I'd smile and nod and change the subject because what was I supposed to say? My son sold my house and stole my future, and I'm not okay. I'm dying inside. I'm so tired I can barely stand, and I don't think I'll ever be okay again. That wasn't the kind of thing you said in a hospital break room over lukewarm coffee and vending machine snacks. I started making mistakes at work. Nothing dangerous, but enough that my supervisor pulled me aside one afternoon and suggested maybe it was time to think about retirement. "You've given 40 years to this hospital, Margaret," she said gently. "Maybe it's time to rest." She meant well, but the suggestion filled me with panic. Retirement meant living on Social Security and Daniel's monthly allowance. It meant giving up the one thing that still gave my life structure and purpose. It meant becoming completely dependent on a son who'd already shown me exactly how much my welfare mattered to him. But I was too tired to fight, too tired to explain, too tired to do anything but nod and say I'd think about it. That night I did something I'd been avoiding. I went through my finances carefully, methodically, trying to figure out exactly how bad things were. My Social Security check was $1,200 a month. Daniel's trust fund gave me another $1,500. That was $2,700 total, which in theory should have been enough to live on. But medical expenses were rising. The cost of my prescriptions kept going up. My car was ancient and would need replacing soon. My apartment building was being sold to developers who planned to renovate and raise rents. Even with Daniel's allowance, I was looking at a future of constant financial stress, of choosing between medications and groceries, of one emergency away from complete disaster. The beach house would have changed everything. If I'd sold it myself, I could have bought a small condo outright. No mortgage, no rent, just property taxes and maintenance. The remaining money could have been invested conservatively, giving me enough income to actually live rather than just survive. I could have afforded better health care, could have traveled a little, could have helped Emma with her student loans the way I'd helped Daniel with everything. Instead, Daniel had that security, that freedom, that future I'd worked for. He had it and I didn't, and there was nothing I could do about it because I'd signed away my right to control my own assets, had trusted him with power he'd immediately abused. I found myself thinking about death more than was probably healthy. Not suicide exactly, but a kind of longing for it to be over, for the struggle to end, for the constant anxiety and humiliation and betrayal to finally stop. What was the point of continuing? To live another 10 or 15 years in poverty while my son enjoyed the money he'd stolen? To watch my body fail, my mind deteriorate, my independence erode until I was completely at the mercy of people who'd already shown they had no mercy. The future looked like nothing but pain and loss and indignity, and I was so tired of hurting. But then something happened. Something small and unexpected that changed the shape of everything that came after. I was at home one afternoon, drowning in self-pity and despair, when my doorbell rang again. I almost didn't answer it. I was in no state for visitors, hadn't showered in days, hadn't even changed out of my nightgown. But the ringing persisted, insistent and slightly aggressive, and eventually I dragged myself to the door. Through the peephole I saw Emma again, but this time she wasn't alone. There was a man with her, silver-haired and distinguished-looking, carrying a briefcase that screamed expensive lawyer. I opened the door in confusion. "Emma, what's this about?" She pushed past me again, but this time her face wasn't sympathetic. It was determined, almost fierce. "Grandma," she said, "this is Marcus Chen. He's an attorney who specializes in elder law. I called him because what Dad did to you isn't just wrong, it might actually be illegal." She turned to the lawyer. Tell her what you told me." Marcus Chen set his briefcase down on my coffee table and extracted a folder. "Ms. Harrison," he said, his voice measured and professional, "I've been reviewing your case based on the information Emma provided. While your son did have power of attorney, there are several concerning aspects of how he exercised that authority. Illinois law requires that anyone acting as power of attorney must act in the principal's best interest. Selling a major asset without consultation, particularly when that asset represents the principal's primary retirement plan, could potentially be challenged as a breach of fiduciary duty. Additionally, the trust he established provides significantly less than what you'd have received if you'd sold the property yourself. That discrepancy could be seen as self-dealing, which is explicitly prohibited under Illinois POA law. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "Are you telling me I can fight this? That I can get my house back?" His expression turned cautious. "The house is already sold, so recovery of the property itself isn't possible. However, we might be able to challenge how the proceeds were distributed. If we can demonstrate that your son acted in his own interest rather than yours, we could potentially recover some or all of the money he kept for himself. It won't be easy, and it won't be cheap, but Emma has agreed to help with my retainer, and I believe we have a case worth pursuing." For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than despair. It wasn't hope exactly, not yet, but it was anger, clean and sharp and energizing. I'd been ready to give up, to accept that this was just how things were, that I had no power and no options. But maybe that wasn't true. Maybe there was still something I could do, some way to fight back, some possibility of justice even if I couldn't undo what had been done. I looked at Emma, at this young woman who'd taken my side when her own father hadn't, who'd used her own money to hire a lawyer for me, who'd believed I deserved better than what I'd gotten. "Why are you doing this?" I asked her. "He's your father." Her eyes hardened. "He's a thief," she said flatly. "And what he did to you is disgusting. I've watched him my whole life treat people like things, like resources to be exploited. I watched him do it to Mom's family when we needed money. I watched him do it to his business partners. But doing it to you, his own mother, the woman who gave him everything? That's where I draw the line. I won't be complicit in this, Grandma. I won't pretend it's okay just because he's my dad." Something shifted in me then. Some fundamental recalibration of who I was and what I was willing to accept. I'd spent my entire life being nice, being accommodating, being the kind of person who absorbed hurt rather than inflicted it. I'd believed that was what good women did, what good mothers did. We took the hits. We turned the other cheek. We forgave and forgave and forgave until there was nothing left of us but this endless capacity for victimhood. But maybe that wasn't virtue. Maybe that was just cowardice dressed up in pretty language about family loyalty and unconditional love. Maybe the right thing to do wasn't to forgive Daniel for stealing from me. Maybe the right thing was to fight back, to demand justice, to refuse to let him get away with it just because challenging him felt uncomfortable or unfamiliar or wrong. I looked at Marcus Chen, at his expensive suit and his briefcase full of legal precedents and his air of professional competence. "What would this cost?" I asked. "What are we talking about in terms of legal fees?" He named a number that made me wince. It was more than I had in my checking account, more than I could afford to lose if we didn't win. But Emma had already pulled out her checkbook. "I'll cover the retainer," she said. "Consider it a loan if you want, or a gift if you don't. Either way, we're doing this. You deserve better than what Dad gave you, and I'm going to make sure you get it." We spent the next hour going over the details of my case. Marcus asked questions about when I'd signed the power of attorney, what Daniel had told me it was for, whether he'd consulted me about other financial decisions. I answered as honestly as I could, though it was painful to admit how completely I'd trusted Daniel, how thoroughly I'd failed to protect myself. Marcus took notes in a leather-bound notebook, his pen moving steadily across the page, reducing my betrayal to bullet points and legal strategy. When we finished, he packed up his briefcase and stood. "I'll start by requesting copies of all relevant financial documents from your son," he said. "If he refuses to provide them, we'll subpoena them. Either way, we'll know within a few weeks whether we have enough to file a formal challenge. In the meantime, document everything. Save all communications with him. Record any phone calls if Illinois law allows it, which it does since we're a two-party consent state, so you'll need to inform him you're recording. Keep a journal of your financial situation and how the sale has impacted you. The more evidence we have, the stronger our case will be." After he left, Emma and I sat in silence for a while. I felt raw and exposed, as if the lawyer had peeled back my skin to examine my wounds in clinical detail. But I also felt something else, something I hadn't felt in weeks. I felt like I mattered. Like my experience was important enough to document and fight for. Like I wasn't just a sad old woman who should accept her fate with grace, but a person who'd been wronged and deserved redress. "Emma," I said finally, "I don't know how to thank you. I don't know if I can ever repay you for this." She squeezed my hand. "You don't have to repay me, Grandma. You just have to fight. Show Dad that he can't do this to people. Show him that you're not just some resource he can exploit whenever he needs money. Show him that you're a person with rights, and you're not going to roll over and accept being robbed." Her words lit something inside me, a spark that had been dormant so long I'd forgotten it was there. Yes, I thought. Yes. I'm going to fight. I'm going to make him face what he did. I'm going to demand that he account for every dollar he took from me. And even if I lose, even if the courts decide he had every legal right to do what he did, at least I'll know I tried. At least I'll know I didn't go quietly into that good night of victimhood and defeat. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I looked at myself in the mirror, really looked, forcing myself to see the woman who stared back at me. She was old, yes, worn out and tired and defeated, but she was still there, still breathing, still capable of anger and hope and the desire for justice. I'd been ready to give up, to let Daniel win by default because fighting felt too hard and too scary and too likely to fail. But Emma had shown me another path. She'd shown me that fighting was possible, that I didn't have to do it alone, that my story mattered enough for someone to invest their time and money in helping me tell it. I started documenting everything, just as Marcus had instructed. I wrote down every conversation I could remember with Daniel over the past 5 years, every time he'd asked about my finances, every suggestion he'd made about my property, every instance where he'd positioned himself as the person who knew better than I did what was good for me. I dug out old bank statements and tax returns. I found the original purchase documents for the beach house, proof of what I'd paid and when. I built a case against my own son, and with each page I added to the growing file of evidence. I felt stronger, less like a victim, more like someone who refused to be victimized. Daniel called a few days later. "Mom?" he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "What the hell is this about a lawyer? Emma told me you're trying to challenge the house sale. Do you have any idea how much time and money you're going to waste? The sale was legal. You gave me power of attorney. You don't have a case." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I have a lawyer who disagrees with you," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "He thinks what you did might constitute breach of fiduciary duty. He thinks you acted in your own interest instead of mine. And even if we don't win in court, Daniel, I want you to know that I'm not okay with what you did. I want you to know that it was wrong, and that I'm not going to pretend otherwise just to keep the peace." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then he laughed, a short, sharp sound without humor. "You're going to regret this, Mom. You're going to spend whatever money you have left on legal fees, and in the end you'll still lose. And you'll lose more than just the court case. You'll lose me. You'll lose your relationship with your son. Is that really what you want?" I thought about his question, thought about what our relationship had become, this hollow thing built on my need for his approval and his willingness to exploit that need. Thought about whether losing something that barely existed anyway was really much of a loss. "If this is what our relationship has been," I said slowly, "then maybe losing it is exactly what I need. Maybe I need to stop pretending that you care about me when your actions say you don't. Maybe I need to stop accepting crumbs and calling it love. You stole from me, Daniel. You took something that wasn't yours, that you knew was important to me, and you did it without any remorse. So no, I'm not going to drop this case to preserve a relationship that apparently only exists in my imagination." He hung up without saying goodbye. I sat there holding my phone, my hand trembling, but my mind clear. I'd done it. I'd stood up to him. I'd told him the truth about how his actions had made me feel, without softening it or apologizing for my feelings or making excuses for his behavior. It was terrifying and exhilarating and absolutely necessary. I'd spent 73 years swallowing my anger to keep other people comfortable, and I was done. Finished. If Daniel wanted a relationship with me, he'd have to earn it by treating me with the respect I deserved. And if he couldn't do that, if his pride and greed were more important than his mother, then maybe I was better off without him. The legal process moved slowly. Marcus filed his initial demand letter, requesting that Daniel provide an accounting of how he'd spent the proceeds from the house sale and asking him to voluntarily return the money he'd kept for himself. Daniel, predictably, refused. His lawyers responded with a letter of their own, claiming that everything had been done properly, that I'd signed a power of attorney giving him complete authority over my finances, and that my claims were baseless and potentially litigious. We escalated to formal discovery, subpoenaing Daniel's financial records, examining the paper trail of how my $2 million had become his investment capital. What we found was both better and worse than I'd expected. Better because there was clear evidence that Daniel had used my money for his own purposes, that the trust he'd set up for me contained a fraction of what I should have gotten, that he'd benefited personally from the sale to the tune of over $1 million. Worse because technically, legally, he'd done nothing explicitly prohibited by the power of attorney I'd signed. The document I'd executed 5 years ago was comprehensive and gave him enormous latitude to make financial decisions on my behalf. Unless we could prove that he'd acted maliciously, that he'd deliberately tried to harm me or enrich himself at my expense, we were likely to lose. But Marcus was creative. He argued that the spirit of the power of attorney had been violated even if the letter hadn't been. He brought in expert witnesses who testified about proper fiduciary standards, about what reasonable people in positions of trust were supposed to do. He found precedent in Illinois case law where power of attorney holders had been held liable for self-dealing, even when the documents gave them broad authority. He built a case not around what Daniel had done, which was technically legal, but around what he should have done, which was consult me before making a decision that fundamentally altered my financial future. The months dragged on. Legal fees mounted. Emma continued to help, supplementing what I could pay with her own money, though I could see the strain it was putting on her. Daniel stopped speaking to me entirely. He sent messages through lawyers, cold and formal, treating me like a hostile business partner rather than his mother. Jennifer blocked me on social media. I was cut off from my own grandchildren, from any news of their lives, from the family I'd spent my whole life building and nurturing and sacrificing for. It hurt more than I wanted to admit, but it also clarified things. If Daniel could cut me out so easily, if our relationship could be severed so completely the moment I stopped being useful and started being inconvenient, then what kind of relationship had it really been? Not the kind worth preserving at any cost. Not the kind worth sacrificing my dignity and self-respect to maintain. Marcus called me one afternoon with unexpected news. "We have something," he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Your son's lawyers made a mistake. They sent us unredacted copies of his correspondence with his financial advisor. In those emails, Daniel explicitly stated that he was selling your property to fund his own business ventures. He wrote, and I quote, 'The old lady doesn't need that much house anyway, and this gives me the capital I need for the Malibu project.' That's direct evidence of self-dealing, Margaret. That's him admitting that he sold your property not because it was in your best interest, but because it was convenient for him. With this, we can win." I sat down hard, my legs suddenly unable to support me. Daniel had written that, had reduced me to the old lady, had dismissed my needs as unimportant, had confessed in writing that he'd stolen from me. Part of me had held on to some small hope that maybe he'd convinced himself he was doing the right thing, that maybe in his own twisted way he'd believed he was helping me. But no. He'd known exactly what he was doing. He'd known it was wrong, and he'd done it anyway because my money was more important to him than my welfare. The case went to mediation before it could go to trial. Daniel's lawyers, seeing the evidence we'd uncovered, suggested we try to reach a settlement. We met in a conference room in downtown Chicago, Marcus and I on one side of a long table, Daniel and his legal team on the other. It was the first time I'd seen my son in months, and the sight of him hit me like a physical blow. He looked older, harder, his face set in lines of stubborn anger. He wouldn't meet my eyes, wouldn't acknowledge my presence except as an obstacle to be overcome. The mediation was brutal. Daniel's lawyers tried to argue that even with the incriminating email, we couldn't prove harm, that the trust fund he'd set up was adequate, that I was being greedy and vindictive. Marcus countered with testimony from financial experts about how much I'd have received if I'd sold the property myself, about the income I'd have generated from proper investment of the proceeds, about the security I'd lost because of Daniel's actions. Numbers flew back and forth, dueling visions of my financial future, reducing my pain to spreadsheets and actuarial tables. Finally, after 8 hours of negotiation, we reached an agreement. Daniel would pay me $800,000 to be transferred immediately into an account in my name only. He would relinquish all power of attorney rights. He would sign an agreement acknowledging that he'd breached his fiduciary duty to me. It wasn't everything. It wasn't the $2 million I should have gotten, but it was enough. Enough to buy a small place of my own, to invest and generate income, to live the rest of my life with some measure of dignity and independence. Most importantly, it was acknowledgement. It was Daniel being forced to admit, legally and formally, that what he'd done was wrong. He signed the papers without looking at me, wrote his signature in angry slashes of blue ink, stood up the moment the mediation was complete and left without a word. Jennifer followed him, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. I watched them go, these people I'd loved and sacrificed for and believed in, and felt nothing but relief. They were gone. They were out of my life. I was free. That night, Emma took me out to dinner to celebrate. We went to a little Italian place in my old neighborhood. Nothing fancy, just good food and dim lighting and the kind of comfortable atmosphere that felt right for the occasion. We toasted with cheap red wine, the kind I could afford now without guilt or anxiety. To justice, Emma said, raising her glass. To standing up for yourself. To not letting them win. I clinked my glass against hers and drank, letting the wine warm my throat and my chest and my heart. Over pasta and bread, Emma asked me what I was going to do now. Where would I live? What would I do with my days? I thought about it, really thought, trying to imagine a future that didn't revolve around work or sacrifice or trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it. I'm going to buy a condo, I said slowly. Something small but nice, maybe on the north side, near the lake. I'm going to retire from nursing, really retire this time. I'm going to travel a little, see places I've always wanted to see but never had time for. I'm going to volunteer, maybe at a women's shelter or a legal aid clinic, help other people who are dealing with family financial abuse. I'm going to live, Emma. For the first time in my life, I'm just going to live without constantly trying to prove my worth or earn my place or justify my existence. She smiled at me across the table, her eyes bright with something that looked like pride. That sounds perfect, Grandma, she said. That sounds like exactly what you deserve. And then she added, quieter. I'm so glad you fought. I'm so glad you didn't just accept what he did. You've taught me something important, you know. You've taught me that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, that you're never too old to demand respect, that family doesn't mean letting people hurt you without consequences. We finished dinner and walked out into the cool Chicago evening. The city spread out around us, all lights and movement and possibility. I felt lighter than I had in years, unburdened by the weight of Daniel's expectations and manipulations. The money in my bank account was a miracle, but the real miracle was how I felt about myself. I'd been so close to giving up, to accepting that this was just how my story would end, in poverty and defeat and quiet desperation. Instead, I'd fought back. I'd refused to be a victim. I'd demanded justice and gotten at least some version of it. The months that followed were transformative. I found a condo just as I'd planned, a one-bedroom unit in a renovated building near Lincoln Park. It had big windows that let in morning light and a small balcony where I could sit and drink coffee and watch the city wake up. It was mine, completely and totally mine. No mortgage, no landlord, no son with power of attorney who could take it away on a whim. I furnished it slowly, carefully, choosing each piece with intention instead of just filling space with whatever was cheap or available. I hung pictures on the walls, photos of places I'd been and wanted to go. I bought books and read them without guilt, without feeling like I should be working or cleaning or doing something more productive. I retired from nursing at the end of that year. My last shift was bittersweet, saying goodbye to colleagues I'd worked with for decades, closing this chapter of my life that had defined me for so long. But I was ready. My body was ready. My mind was ready. My spirit was ready. I'd given enough to the hospital, to my patients, to everyone who'd needed pieces of me over the years. It was time to give something to myself. I started volunteering at a legal aid clinic that specialized in elder law, sharing my story with other older adults who'd been financially exploited by family members. It was harder than I'd expected, hearing their stories, recognizing my own pain reflected in their faces. But it was also healing, transformative. I could help them in ways I couldn't help myself when I'd been in their position. I could connect them with resources, explain their rights, offer the kind of support and validation I'd desperately needed during my darkest days. Every person I helped felt like a small victory, a way of transforming my suffering into something useful. I reconnected with old friends, people I'd lost touch with during the years when I'd been too busy working and trying to please Daniel to maintain relationships that didn't serve some immediate purpose. We went to movies and museums, took day trips to places we'd always meant to visit. I discovered parts of Chicago I'd never explored, found restaurants and galleries and quiet parks that became my new favorites. I was 74 years old, and I was finally living the way I'd always imagined I would when I was younger, before life got complicated and hard, before I learned to make myself small to accommodate other people's needs. Daniel never called, never apologized, never acknowledged what he'd done beyond the legally mandated admission in our settlement agreement. Part of me had hoped that once the dust settled, once he'd had time to think, he might reach out, might try to rebuild some version of our relationship. But as the months passed, I realized that wasn't going to happen. And slowly, painfully, I came to terms with it. Maybe he couldn't admit he'd been wrong. Maybe his ego wouldn't allow it. Maybe he'd told himself a story where I was the villain, the greedy mother who'd sued her own son out of spite. Or maybe he just didn't care, had moved on with his life and his new Malibu home and his business ventures funded by money he'd stolen from me. It didn't matter anymore. I'd spent enough time trying to understand Daniel's motivations, trying to find some explanation that would make his betrayal hurt less. The truth was simple. He'd prioritized his own comfort over my welfare, had seen an opportunity to enrich himself and taken it without regard for how it would affect me. That was who he was. That was who he'd always been, if I'd been willing to see it. I couldn't change him. I couldn't make him feel remorse he didn't feel. All I could do was move forward with my own life, build my own happiness, stop waiting for an apology or acknowledgement that was never going to come. Emma remained constant. She visited regularly, called just to check in, included me in parts of her life in a way Daniel never had. We became genuinely close, not just grandmother and granddaughter playing roles, but two women who respected and enjoyed each other. She told me about her work and her relationships and her struggles, treating me like a person with valuable insights rather than an elderly relative to be humored. I told her about my volunteer work and my travels and my slowly expanding social circle. We built something real between us, something not based on obligation or guilt, but on actual affection and mutual respect. One afternoon, about a year after the settlement, Emma came to my condo with news. She'd gotten engaged to her longtime girlfriend, a software engineer named Priya. They wanted to get married in the spring, something small and intimate, just close friends and family. As she talked about her plans, I could see the hesitation in her face. She was working up to something, some question she wasn't sure how to ask. Finally, she just said it straight out. "Grandma, I'm not inviting Dad and Jennifer to the wedding. After what Dad did to you, after how he treated you, I just can't have him there. But I want you to know that if you need me to invite him, if it would be too hard for you to be there without him, I'll understand. The day is important, but not as important as you." I thought about it for a long moment. Thought about standing up at Emma's wedding without my son there, about the gossip and questions and awkward explanations that would inevitably follow. Thought about the satisfaction Daniel would get from knowing his absence was causing problems, from knowing he still had the power to make things complicated. But mostly I thought about Emma, about this young woman who'd stood by me when her own father wouldn't, who'd risked her relationship with Daniel to help me fight for justice, who'd shown me that family loyalty could work both ways if you were brave enough to demand it. "Don't invite him," I said firmly. "This is your day, Emma. Your wedding. You should be surrounded by people who love and support you, not by someone who might turn the occasion into another opportunity for drama or manipulation. If people ask where Daniel is, I'll tell them the truth, that we're estranged, and it's his own fault. I'm done protecting him from the consequences of his actions. I'm done pretending things are fine when they're not." She hugged me then, tight and fierce. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for understanding. Thank you for being here. Thank you for teaching me that it's okay to cut toxic people out of your life, even when they're family." I held her and thought about all the years I'd wasted trying to be the bigger person, trying to forgive and move on, and not hold grudges. Those virtues had their place, but so did anger and boundaries, and the simple act of saying no more. "You've hurt me enough, I'm done." Emma understood that in a way I'd only recently learned. She was kinder to herself than I'd ever been, more willing to protect her own peace, more conscious of the cost of keeping cruel people in her life. I was proud of her. Proud of who she'd become despite having Daniel as a father. Proud of the choices she was making. Proud to be included in her life. The wedding was beautiful. They held it in a botanical garden on a perfect May afternoon, with flowers blooming everywhere and sunlight filtering through green leaves. Emma looked radiant in her simple white dress, Priya stunning in an emerald sari that caught the light as she moved. I sat in the front row and cried through the whole ceremony, not sad tears but happy ones, grateful tears. Tears of release and joy and profound relief that at least one thing in my life had turned out right. The love between Emma and Priya was so clear, so genuine, so uncomplicated by the kind of manipulation and transactional thinking that had poisoned my relationship with Daniel. This was what family should be. This was what love looked like when it was real. At the reception, I danced for the first time in years. I ate good food and drank champagne and laughed with Emma's friends, who treated me like an honored guest rather than someone to be tolerated. People asked about Daniel's absence. I told them simply that we were estranged, that he'd done something I couldn't forgive, and left it at that. Some people pushed for details. I politely declined to provide them. This wasn't the time or place for that story. This was Emma's day, a celebration of her happiness, and I wasn't going to taint it with old grievances and family dysfunction. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had left, Emma and Priya sat with me on a bench overlooking the gardens. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. "It's been quite a year," Emma said softly. "When I think about where you were when all this started, how defeated you seemed, and look at you now." Her voice trailed off, but I knew what she meant. I was different now, stronger, more sure of myself, less willing to accept mistreatment in exchange for the illusion of family harmony. I learned something important, I said, my eyes on the sunset. I learned that you can love someone deeply and still set boundaries. You can honor your past with them while refusing to let them hurt you in the present. You can choose yourself without being selfish. For 73 years, I thought being a good mother, a good person, meant enduring anything, forgiving everything, never putting my own needs first. But that's not love. That's martyrdom, and martyrdom might feel noble in the moment, but in the end, it just destroys you. Priya reached over and squeezed my hand. "That's beautiful," she said. "That's something everyone should learn, but most people never do. You're an inspiration, Margaret. Really." I felt myself flush with pleasure at her words. An inspiration. Me, the old lady who'd been naive enough to sign over power of attorney to her son, who'd spent decades being exploited without fighting back, who'd nearly given up entirely when she should have been fighting. But maybe that was exactly what made the story worth telling. Maybe the inspiration wasn't in being perfect, but in being flawed and hurt and defeated and still finding the strength to stand back up. As I sat there between these two young women, watching the sky turn from gold to purple to deep blue, I thought about everything that had happened over the past 18 months. The betrayal and grief and anger, the legal battle and financial stress and family fracture, the slow rebuilding of my sense of self, the gradual understanding that I deserved better than what I'd been accepting. It had been the hardest year of my life in many ways, but also the most important. I'd learned who I was when I wasn't trying to be who everyone else needed me to be. I'd discovered reserves of strength I didn't know I possessed. I'd built a new life, not the one I'd planned with the beach house and the retirement I'd imagined, but something else, something authentic and mine. The money from the settlement sat in my bank account, carefully invested, generating enough income that I didn't have to worry about choosing between food and medication, that I could help Emma occasionally without impoverishing myself, that I could travel and volunteer and live without the constant anxiety of impending financial disaster. But the money wasn't really what had saved me. What had saved me was the decision to fight back, to refuse to be a victim, to demand that Daniel face consequences for what he'd done. Even if I'd lost the legal case, even if I'd spent every penny on lawyers and gotten nothing back, the act of fighting would have been worth it. Because it had given me back myself. It had reminded me that I mattered, that my feelings were valid, that I deserved respect and consideration and basic human decency from the people who claimed to love me. I started speaking publicly about my experience, sharing my story at conferences and support groups for older adults dealing with financial exploitation. It was terrifying at first, standing up in front of strangers and admitting how naive I'd been, how thoroughly I'd been manipulated by my own son. But the response was overwhelming. After every talk, people would come up to me in tears, thanking me for putting words to their own experiences, for making them feel less alone. I heard so many stories, each one slightly different but fundamentally the same. Trusted family members who'd taken advantage, elderly parents who'd been systematically stripped of their assets and autonomy, children who'd decided their inheritance was more important than their parents' well-being. The statistics were staggering. Financial abuse of the elderly was vastly underreported, with most victims too ashamed or frightened to come forward. Many of them, like I'd been, had signed documents giving family members legal authority over their finances. Many had no idea they could challenge those arrangements, no idea that power of attorney came with fiduciary responsibilities, no idea that self-dealing was prohibited even when technically legal. I became an advocate, working with the legal aid clinic to develop resources for other victims, pushing for stronger protections under Illinois law, telling my story over and over in the hope that it might prevent someone else from going through what I'd gone through. One afternoon, about 18 months after Emma's wedding, I got an unexpected phone call. "Margaret Harrison?" a woman's voice asked. "This is Sarah from Illinois Elder Rights Coalition. We've been following your advocacy work, and we'd like to invite you to testify before the state legislature about proposed amendments to our power of attorney laws. Your personal experience would be invaluable in helping lawmakers understand why these changes are necessary." I said yes, without hesitation, without even thinking about how terrifying it would be to stand up in front of politicians and lawyers and tell them about the worst experience of my life. This was important. This mattered. If my suffering could be transformed into better protections for other vulnerable adults, then it would all mean something. The testimony was scheduled for a cold morning in January. I rode the train down to Springfield, rehearsing what I'd say, trying to condense my story into the 5 minutes I'd been allotted. Emma came with me for support, sitting in the gallery while I took my seat at the witness table. The legislators looked bored, shuffling papers, checking their phones. I wondered if anything I said would make a difference, if anyone would really hear me, or if this was just political theater, a box to check before they did whatever they were going to do anyway. But then I started talking. I told them about signing the power of attorney, about discovering the house sale, about the betrayal and grief and anger. I told them about how I'd fought back, about the legal case and the settlement and the long road to recovery. I told them about all the other victims I'd met through my advocacy work, about the patterns I'd seen, about how easy it was for family members to exploit the trust of elderly relatives. My voice shook at first, but as I continued, it grew stronger, steadier, filled with the certainty that what I was saying needed to be said. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. Then one of the legislators, an older woman with kind eyes, leaned forward. "Ms. Harrison," she said, "thank you for your courage in sharing this story. I want you to know that your testimony today will be part of the official record, and it will absolutely inform our decisions as we move forward with these reforms. What happened to you should never happen to anyone, and we're going to do everything in our power to prevent it." I left Springfield feeling like I'd accomplished something real, something that would outlast me. The laws would change. Protections would strengthen. Other families would be required to consult with elderly relatives before making major financial decisions on their behalf. It wouldn't prevent all abuse, couldn't possibly catch every manipulative child or scheming caregiver, but it would help. It would make it harder for people like Daniel to do what he'd done without consequences. And that felt like justice, not just for me, but for everyone who'd been where I'd been, everyone who'd trusted the wrong person and paid the price. That evening, back in my condo, I did something I'd been avoiding for 2 years. I allowed myself to think about the beach house, really think about it, without the overlay of grief and anger that had colored every memory since Daniel sold it. I closed my eyes and pictured it as it had been the last time I'd visited, before everything fell apart. The wraparound porch with its comfortable chairs, the kitchen where I'd imagined cooking meals for visiting family, the bedroom with its view of the lake, the water stretching to the horizon like an invitation to dream. It was gone. I'd never stand on that porch again, never watch sunrise over Lake Michigan from those windows, never harvest tomatoes from the garden I'd planted. That particular future, the one I'd worked so hard to create, was lost. But as I sat with that loss, really sat with it instead of running from it or drowning in it, I realized something important. The beach house had been a dream, a symbol of everything I'd hoped my life would become. But it had never been the only dream possible. There were other futures, other ways to find peace and rest and beauty. I was living in one of them right now, in this condo I'd bought with my settlement money, in this life I'd built from the wreckage of my original plans. Maybe this was better. Maybe I didn't need 3 acres and a view of the lake to be happy. Maybe happiness was simpler than that. Autonomy, dignity, respect, genuine connection with people who actually cared about me. I had all of those things now, had fought for them and claimed them and built a life around them. Yes, I'd lost the beach house, but I'd found myself. And in the end, that seemed like a fair trade. I thought about Daniel sometimes, wondered what his life looked like now, whether he ever thought about me or felt any regret for what he'd done. Emma occasionally passed along news, carefully neutral updates that didn't require me to respond. He'd opened a restaurant in Malibu. It was doing well. Jennifer was pregnant with their third child. They'd bought a bigger house, upgraded cars, were living the life his stolen money had purchased. Part of me wanted to feel bitter about it, wanted to rage against the unfairness of him thriving while I'd suffered. But mostly, I just felt nothing. He'd made his choices. I'd made mine. We were living in separate worlds now, connected only by biology and history, no longer bound by the obligations and expectations that had once seemed unbreakable. I wondered if he'd teach his children the same values he'd learned, whether they'd grow up thinking that family was something to be exploited, that love was transactional, that taking advantage of vulnerable people was just smart business. I hoped not, but I had no control over it, no way to influence how he parented or what lessons they absorbed. All I could do was be there for Emma, model a different way of being in relationship, show her that family could be built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation and guilt. 3 years after the settlement, I took a trip I'd been dreaming about for decades. I flew to Ireland, rented a car, and spent 2 weeks driving along the coast, staying in small bed and breakfasts, eating in local pubs, talking to strangers who became temporary friends. It was magical in ways I couldn't have anticipated. This sense of freedom and possibility, of being completely myself in a place where no one knew my history or had expectations about who I should be. I hiked along cliffsides and toured ancient castles and stood in stone circles that had been sacred spaces for thousands of years. I felt connected to something larger than myself, to the great sweep of human history, to all the people who'd come before me and struggled and suffered and somehow found ways to keep going. On my last night in Ireland, I sat in a pub in a tiny village whose name I can no longer remember. There was live music, a fiddler and a guitarist playing traditional songs that made my chest ache with their beauty. The locals sang along, their voices blending together in harmonies that seemed to have been passed down through generations. I sat with my pint of cider and let the music wash over me. Let myself feel the full weight of everything I'd been through and everything I'd survived. I'd been so close to giving up, so close to accepting that my life was over, that all that remained was a slow decline into poverty and irrelevance and defeat. Instead, I'd fought back. I'd demanded justice. I'd rebuilt my life from scratch. I'd transformed my suffering into advocacy that would help others. I'd found joy and purpose and connection in places I never expected. I'd learned that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, never too old to start over, never too broken to heal. The musicians finished their set and the pub began to empty. I paid my bill and walked back to my B&B through streets lit by old-fashioned lamps, the cool night air clearing my head. Tomorrow I'd fly home to Chicago, back to my condo and my volunteer work and my quiet, dignified life. But tonight I was here, in this ancient place, feeling more alive and whole than I had in years. I'd lost so much, but I'd gained something more precious, myself, my voice, my agency, my right to say no, this is not acceptable, I deserve better. Back in Chicago, life continued its steady rhythm. I celebrated my 77th birthday, surrounded by friends from my advocacy work and my volunteer organization, people who knew my story and valued my presence. Emma and Priya came, bringing their daughter, my great-granddaughter, a tiny, perfect being named Maya, who looked at me with big, curious eyes and didn't care about my age or my past or anything. except that I was warm and smiling and happy to hold her. I thought about what I'd tell Maya when she was old enough to understand, what wisdom I'd pass down from my years of hard-won experience. I'd tell her that love shouldn't hurt. That family doesn't mean accepting mistreatment, that she should never make herself small to accommodate other people's egos or cruelty. I'd tell her that it's okay to fight back when someone wrongs her, that demanding justice isn't the same as being vindictive, that protecting yourself isn't selfish. I'd tell her that her worth isn't determined by what she does for others, or how useful she makes herself, or how much she sacrifices. I'd tell her that she's valuable simply because she exists, because she's human, because she deserves respect and dignity and basic kindness from the people in her life. Most importantly, I'd tell her my story, not to burden her or frighten her, but to show her that resilience is real, that people can survive terrible betrayals and come out stronger on the other side, that it's never too late to change course and demand better. I'd tell her about the beach house and the power of attorney and the legal battle. I'd tell her about the settlement and the advocacy work and the laws that changed, because I was brave enough to speak up. I'd tell her about Ireland and the pub and the music that made me cry. I'd tell her about all of it, the pain and the triumph, the defeat and the rebirth, because stories like mine need to be told, need to be passed down, need to be remembered so that younger generations learn from our mistakes and our victories. As I held baby Maya and looked around at the people who'd gathered to celebrate my birthday, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Not gratitude for what Daniel had done, never that, but gratitude for what I'd become in response to it. He'd tried to diminish me, to reduce me to nothing more than a resource to be exploited. Instead, he'd inadvertently given me the push I needed to become someone stronger, braver, more authentically myself than I'd ever been when I was trying to earn his love. The afternoon of my birthday party, after everyone had left and the condo was quiet again, I sat on my balcony and watched the sun set over Chicago. The city spread out before me, millions of lives being lived, millions of stories unfolding, each one as complex and painful and beautiful as my own. Somewhere out there, other elderly people were being exploited by family members they trusted. Other mothers were signing documents that would be used against them. Other victims were choosing to stay silent because fighting back felt too hard, too scary, too likely to fail. I couldn't save them all. Couldn't personally intervene in every case of elder financial abuse. But I could keep telling my story, could keep advocating for stronger protections, could keep showing up at legal aid clinics and support groups and legislative hearings, bearing witness to my own experience in the hope that it would illuminate the path for others. That felt like enough. That felt like purpose. That felt like a reason to have survived everything I'd survived. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. I thought about the beach house one last time, letting myself feel the loss of it without being consumed by it. Yes, I'd wanted that life, that specific future I'd spent decades working toward. But this life, the one I'd actually ended up with, had its own beauty. It had Emma and Priya and baby Maya. It had meaningful work and genuine friendships. It had hard-won wisdom and earned peace. It had the satisfaction of knowing I'd stood up for myself when it mattered most, that I'd fought back against injustice and won at least partially, that I'd refused to be a victim, refused to accept that my suffering was just the price of being old and female and vulnerable. The light faded, and the city's lights began to glow in the gathering darkness. I thought about all the people I'd met through my advocacy work, all the stories of pain and resilience I'd heard. We were a tribe, we survivors of family financial abuse. We understood each other in ways that outsiders never could. We'd been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect us, exploited by the children or spouses or siblings we'd trusted most. And yet, we'd survived. We'd fought back. We'd rebuilt our lives from wreckage and found reasons to keep going. That was the real story, I realized. Not the betrayal itself, But what came after? Not Daniel selling the house, but me deciding to fight. Not the loss of my original dreams, but the creation of new ones. Not the pain, but the healing. Not the defeat, but the rebirth. That was what I needed people to understand when they heard my story. That yes, terrible things happen. People we love hurt us in ways we never imagined possible. But we don't have to let those experiences define us. We can choose to fight back. We can choose to grow. We can choose to transform our suffering into something that helps others and honors our own journey. I sat on that balcony until the sky was fully dark and the air grew too cool for comfort. When I finally went inside, I felt settled in a way I hadn't in years. The past would always be part of me, would always hurt in some quiet corner of my heart. But it didn't control me anymore, didn't define me, didn't dictate my future. I'd taken back my power, my voice, my right to a life of dignity and respect. And that, more than any house or any amount of money or any reconciliation with Daniel, was what healing looked like. Before bed, I did something I'd started doing after the settlement. I wrote in a journal, not about what had happened during the day, but about what I'd learned, what wisdom I wanted to remember and pass on. Tonight I wrote about resilience and rebirth, about how it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be, about how fighting for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary, about how family love that requires you to diminish yourself isn't really love at all, about how the life you end up with might be even better than the life you planned, if you're brave enough to let go of old dreams and embrace new possibilities. I closed the journal and set it on my nightstand. Tomorrow I'd wake up and volunteer at the legal aid clinic. I'd help other people navigate the complicated process of challenging financial abuse. I'd tell my story to anyone who needed to hear it. I'd continue building this life I'd created from the ashes of my old one. I'd be present for Emma and her family. I'd travel when I could afford it. I'd read books and take long walks and have coffee with friends. I'd do all the ordinary, beautiful things that make up a well-lived life. But tonight, I'd sleep well, knowing I'd done the hard work of saving myself, knowing I'd refused to be a victim, knowing I'd demanded justice and gotten at least some version of it, knowing I'd transformed my pain into purpose, knowing I'd survived. And that was enough. Have you or someone you know experienced financial exploitation by family members, especially those in positions of trust? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe so more people can find these stories and know they're not alone in their struggles. Your support helps us reach others who need to hear that fighting back is possible and recovery is real.